Hello.
Hello.
Welcome everyone. Good morning. Good morning. This is an unusual day. I felt guilty sleeping a little bit later this morning. My neck is better. It is about 80% better is the number I'm getting. So I'm functional. I'm not in tremendous pain. It's better than being down at zero where I was before. So welcome everyone. Donna, would you introduce your guest to us?
This is Kira McFarland.
Kira.
Kira.
Yeah, was with us on Wednesday as well. And would you like to introduce your guests? Yes. Carol, we're glad to have you as well. And I'm looking around the room. Oh, Charlene James is here with us.
Yay. Good to be here.
So for those of you who are new-ish and don't know, Charlene and her late husband Bill were here for 33 years. And a half. And Bill was our minister of music during that time, and Charlene was involved in, she was the wedding coordinator and many other things. But she lives down in the hill country now, and we're glad to have you visiting with us today as well. Visiting is the wrong word, back with us today. So an announcement, and then we'll lots to talk about at prayer concern time at the end of the lesson today. An announcement is that if you have signed up for the Thanksgiving dinner luncheon, Thanksgiving luncheon this year, and we had 56 of us who signed up.
Wow.
From this class alone.
56.
Yeah. Now, where's everyone today? Right? I've turned in your names. Your names are on the chart at the front office, and you need to go by the front office and pay. So don't give me your money. I'll lose it. Yes. Yes. We've got a couple of extra spots at our tables, but we've got 7 tables. We've got 7 tables from our class. Yes, 8. Yeah, 8 at a table. And so I went through and sort of filled in the thing and do what you want with that, but you need to pay there.
Okay.
They'll keep track of that. So that's about a month away.
Is it $9?
I think it's 9.
Yes.
$9 a person. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then of course I hope you're staying for the hymn sing today. It's gonna be a glorious day. I was just in there. There are microphones everywhere. And Sanctuary Choir was rehearsing, and that sounded glorious.
Are there screens in there?
We're not going that far. There's a limit to everything. There's a limit to everything. Yeah. Cody,
When we go to luncheon, can we just drop our checks in the basket
there's
or
just
what?
going to be a basket
Okay,
there. Yeah.
thank you.
Which reminds me, I need to get the baskets out. All right, Thanksgiving baskets.
Bye.
Listen up, everyone.
I have a basket collecting food and it looks really sad today.
Right here.
So we have 2 more Sundays
Ooh, we need
and I
food,
will
y'all.
send out a reminder this week. And you will get tired of me nagging you, but this is our service project. And so, we need to show Heather and the whole church that what we can do.
Yeah, thank you, Terry, for spearheading this. And if you'd like to contribute to these baskets, go to families at the who are served by the Wilkinson Center. And so they've been screened and chosen for this.
Is it next Sunday fallback's time change?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Daylight saving, singular time. I learned that this week, and there's no S on savings. Did you know that? It's daylight saving time.
What is that saving day?
Yeah.
Earlier.
So it's fallback.
We get an extra hour sleep.
Get it? Yeah.
And this is the good, this is the,
Gain an hour.
this is the good one.
Yes,
This is
Yeah,
good.
it's a good.
Gain an hour.
Yeah, that's what I say, this is the good
fall
one.
back, spring forward.
There's one more home fellowship left out of the 10 that we've been offering in October, because October's almost over. And it's tomorrow night at the Moorheads. If you've not been to one of the home fellowships, invite you to just pop in. The information is online and it's in your worship folder today as well. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. These have just been a wonderful time. We've had such good conversation, and people get to meet other people, and we get out of our little bubbles and silos and all that. It's been really, really fun. So I know many of you have already been to a home fellowship, and anyhow, that's that. I think that's it by way of announcements for things. All right, so we're gonna finish the book of Titus today. I feel it. Yeah. So we left off last week. We are ready for verse 9 in chapter 3, which is near the end. So would someone volunteer to read for us verse 9 through 11? Verse 9 through 11. Who's my reader? Okay.
No,
You read better.
No, you read.
All right, Francis.
Okay, but avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and arguments and quarrels about the law, because these are unprofitable and useless. Warn a divisive person once, and then warn him a second time. After that, have nothing to do with him. You may be sure that such a man is warped and sinful. He is self-condemned. This is this. What you really think? Yeah, tell me what you really think. Okay, I can't remember my version.
Yeah, so, okay, remember context. Paul is writing to Titus, who's a leader in one of the early house churches, and they're trying to get established, and they're having problems because you brought together all these different people who would have different ideas, and they're trying to figure out what the church is. I mean, the word church is sort of new in all of this. So you have Jewish converts who are used to being in the temple and that system. You have previously pagan people who are coming into the church and have not the same experience. And then you have opportunists who are coming into the church trying to sell their ideas, sort of like Professor Harold Hill with his band equipment. They see an open market, and here are some people, and that still happens in the church from time to time when people come for business purposes more than spiritual purposes as well. So that's sort of the context, is we have all this good admonition, and now here at the end of the letter, Paul is warning Titus about things that divide. And you may be wondering, genealogies. What in the world? And this is not an admonition against doing genealogy work. You're not living a life of sin, at least not in that regard. This has to do with a peculiar and particular line of conversation that people were obsessing on, who genealogical information that had to do with stupid stuff. The word stupid is in here, right? Who knew? It was a distraction. It was getting off the track. It was losing focus on the main point of that. So, verse 9 begins, again, the word translated in English is stupid. Avoid stupid controversies, which would imply maybe there are some not stupid controversies. But what he's basically saying here is don't get distracted. Don't get distracted from the main thing that's going on. Dissensions, quarrels about the law, and the reason he gives is they're unprofitable and worthless. Now, some of you know people, some of you may be these people, I don't think so, who just like to argue. This lawyers, but not you. Yeah. But you know the type, right? There are people who you can tell them the sky is blue, and they're gonna argue with you over it just because they love a good fight, right? And so I think part of this is that kind of idea in the early church. People stirring things up when they didn't need to. It's pointless. It's pointless. And how many churches throughout time have devolved into pointless arguments over the color of the carpet, the flowers, the hymnal, the choir robes, what the pastor wears, whatever. What kind of food served at lunch? All of those things really get down into things that are pointless and that lead us away from the main thing. So, are we together on that point so far? Now, here's what Paul says to Titus about dealing with people who create dissension in the church. And here's where it gets a little tough. I need to remind you that sometimes this falls to people like me. And so I was thinking about this last year or year before when the deacons and the risk management committee adopted a policy on weapons. After the legislature allowed you to carry weapons pretty much anywhere in the state of Texas, we had this long conversation about should we allow people to carry guns into the church. And the answer we came to was no, but the state law requires you to post a ginormous sign. It's about like this. That's the way the statute was written. You've seen them in a lot of places. They're huge, right?
Right.
And it's supposed to be in English and Spanish.
You should just draw a picture of the camera.
That doesn't meet the code. But there is a provision in which you can also notify people. And so the answer we came up with, rather than posting big signs at there are like 17 doors into this church, by the way. And like right out here, you take up the whole door to put one of those signs on there. So according to the statute, you've got it. But there's a workaround where you can notify people of a policy orally. And guess who the deacons and the risk management committee decided should be the one to give that notification? Mark can do that. So we've got a little card that I'm supposed to be able to hand out to someone to let them know if they come packing.
With the rifle.
And if you have your concealed carry with you, Dad, I don't even want to know about it. Carol Ann?
So do you have to decide whether they look like they're carrying a gun or not?
Oh.
I've not had to so far. Yeah, knock on something. Yeah. So this made me think of that. Right? So here Paul gives the advice, after a first and a second admonition, have nothing more to do with anyone who causes divisions, since you know that such a person is perverted and sinful, being self-condemned. Now that is harsh. That's harsh, right? So is every person who causes difficulty in a church perverted and sinful and self-condemned?
No.
Uh-huh, and no. I heard both answers. My gosh, that's, I think maybe there's some level within here, but the issue seems to be someone who will not listen to reason, right?
And I think part of it, the Living Bible says, and he knows it.
And he is sinning and he knows it. Now that to me kind of changes or makes a division down what goes on.
Well, that's a good point, yes.
And I would suggest that perhaps some of the people who left our church would view us in the same light.
Well, it probably
Depends
runs
on
both
your
ways.
depends on your
Right.
point of view, doesn't it?
Right, depends on your point of view, who's causing the dissension,
Right.
right? So there is knowledgeable dissension. I would argue there's even appropriate dissension. There is a way to disagree
Oh, yeah.
without stirring up trouble. But there's a way to stir up trouble just for the sake of stirring up trouble. And I've dealt with some of those folks through the years as well. And sometimes it's rooted just in meanness, but sometimes it's also rooted in mental illness or spiritual illness. And that is really difficult to deal with. I recently had a communication from a parent of a youth who wrote saying the youth was very distressed because there was a particular situation we'd had to deal with where there was just a threat of bodily harm to someone because of a behavior that is a medical condition. And we've had to ask that person not to come to church. And the youth said, but I thought we were open to everyone. Okay? And so the answer I had to give is, yes, we are. But even in openness, there are limits to what we can tolerate when it becomes unsafe for other people, right? And that is a really, really tough call, right? So it would be very rare for us to say, we need you not to come to church right now. But there are also times in which I wish I could say to people, we need you not to come to church because you're so mean. So where does this leave us? And I think, Cody's point is really good about knowledge. When someone is knowingly causing trouble, for whatever reason, and this happens in churches everywhere, all over a multitude of issues. Someone has an agenda against whatever, or they're not getting their way about something. We had I dealt with someone several years ago who had just a very personal problem against a staff member, and they couldn't let go. They could not let go of their hatred of that staff member.
Oh.
That was just based in their own issues, right? And that person decided that, who's still a good friend, that the best thing was to be somewhere else, right? Because it was that person's problem. It was not our problem, right? So there's some self-awareness in that.
Yeah, no,
But a lot of times people who are angry don't have that level of self-awareness, right? And so here the answer is, there comes a point in which you've got to say, I'm not going to enable you anymore in this.
Setting boundaries.
Yeah, it's setting boundaries. So here's the problem I've learned about this. Most lay people in a church don't want to have to set those kind of boundaries, because you all are very generous and you want to think the best of everyone, and you will do your best to try to keep the peace. And often those types of decisions end up falling to staff to deal with. Occasionally, there'll be some elected church leadership that will step in if they have to. These are rare situations, right? But most people who come to church, even if you're let's say you're a deacon or a committee chair or somehow involved in a leadership role in the church, you don't expect to have to be confrontational in that, right? And yet there are times when boundaries have to be set, right? So 1 warning, admonition, 2 warnings, 3 strikes, you're out. Does that seem too harsh to you? What does out mean? Well, I think it means there are some accepted norms of behavior within the community of faith. And if you're not willing to abide by those norms of behavior, then you need to not be in the community of faith here or wherever, right? This is a very hard thing. Now, back in the old days, you know, you could get churched. That's what they called it. You could get kicked out of a church. And there's been our bylaws allow it. There's a provision in our bylaws about the expulsion of a member. Really? Oh yes. There's a way to be expelled. And
Well, speaking of genealogy, I learned that one of my great aunts in Tennessee was actually brought before the church in a trial. There were witnesses and decision, and she was let go.
so there was a period, there was a period in American history in which this was really prominent. I mean, this happened.
If you read Quaker records, every time it seems several were.
Yeah, different branches of Christianity are more eager about this than others. But there's been a resurgence in the past 15, 20 years of this among the hyper-Calvinist churches. Church discipline is what it's called. So now some of these prominent figures, like Mark Driscoll, who was disgraced is he in Portland or Seattle? Portland.
I believe.
Yeah, he was in Portland. Grew a big church and very masculine oriented and very, anyhow, that church eventually fell apart. They were big on church discipline, right? And so you'll see this some places carried out with a firm hand. We're just a little too nice for that most of the time, right? Little too nice for that.
Most churches are, aren't they, Mark?
Well, I think most are, because most people are conflict averse.
But is that when someone stands up in front of the congregation and says, I did this and is ashamed by the church, or what is that?
So this would be where
There are certain churches that do that.
Yeah. Well, so if you've been to a home fellowship, you've heard George tell this story. It's part of Wilshire's origin story. Mm-hmm. Because the people who started Wilshire had got churched. Mm-hmm. This is what now, from our view, they were not in the wrong. So the old Lakewood Baptist Church that no longer exists, that's where we sprang from. And there was I'll tell you the Wilshire version of the story. There's always 2 sides to a story, right? The Wilshire version of the story is that the pastor was very aggressive in demanding pledge cards from people for their giving. And if you didn't turn in a pledge card, or you didn't turn in a pledge card with enough on it, based on what he thought you ought to be giving, people were sent after you. And so the way George tells the story is, well, I suspect he makes about $50,000. You better come back with a pledge card with at least $5,000 on it, right? And the folks who started Wilshire thought that was heavy-handed and didn't like it, and they were protesting it. And they showed up at church, and the pastor and his other leadership had already prepared their church letters to hand them, and they churched them.
Oh.
They were kicked out of Lakewood Baptist Church.
Oh my God.
Did you know that story?
No.
So that's a form of church discipline. They were kicked out of Lakewood Baptist Church, and then they met the next night at Dr. Carswell's house in Lakewood, in the upper room, so to speak. It was an upstairs room. And that was the genesis of Wilshire.
How many people? Was there very many?
That's 60, I think.
It was
think
about,
so.
yeah, some others came along. Yeah.
Where was it located?
Lakewood is now Lake Hill Prep,
Okay, yes.
Preparatory Academy in, down in Lakewood. Yeah, that's the property. Yeah, so that's, that's where we've come from church discipline, Preston.
There were some other things in that church too. Some of the members wanted to see the church books, and the pastor said, no, you don't need to see the books. And then one person told me, he said, I didn't even know we were in a building program till I saw the steel being unloaded for the new building. So there was a little breakdown of communication there.
So that's a case where I think the people who got church were probably in the right. At least that's the way we need to tell the story here. Right. And ultimately that church didn't survive either, which is another thing. There were a lot of problems. But how does a church get into a long-term pattern of bad decisions? Often it's by not confronting issues when they arise.
Exactly.
And not dealing with it. So think about a marriage. Think about a work relationship. When issues arise and they get swept under the rug, and swept under the rug, and swept under the rug, what happens over time?
Breakdown.
Ultimately, you have an explosion, right? When you don't deal with issues as they arise, ultimately you get to some point in which the pressure is just too great, and it may be not recoverable then. So I think one of the reasons for Paul's advice to Titus here is, to quote Barney Fife, you got to nip it in the bud. Right? Don't let it linger. And I think that's part of what's going on here. What do y'all think? Yes.
I would say in another venue, when I worked for Parkland, the same kind of thing would happen with patients that were causing problems. And of course, they always sent all the problem patients to the social workers. Anybody was crying, anybody was mad or upset, then we dealt with it. But there was a process in place if that was really disruptive to do almost this exact thing. It was three times, and it would be education oriented, and also try to address whatever the issue was and negotiation and all that. But the ultimate thing was to inform them that if you can't change this behavior, and sometimes it would be, threatening the staff and that kind of thing. There was a process in place that the doctor was able to discharge the patient where they could no longer come for treatment, and that's a pretty big issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it very seldom got to that, but sometimes it had to. And it was, it was it's in the books about how to do that, and about how to then, if you confront them and you try to understand what's going on and you try to help them to see through it, and it can't be worked out, then the ultimate thing was you're going to have to leave and find someplace else to get your treatment.
That's a good example. And so think about the comparison to what's in the Gospel of Matthew. You're familiar with that passage. What chapter is that in Matthew?
Give us a hint.
About when there's a dispute with someone, you need
You go make it right.
Confront it.
you go talk to them, and then
yeah.
first privately, and then second you take someone with you, and there's a process. Matthew 17, I think, is what it is. Right? There's a process given in there for interpersonal conflict. that's not really much different than this, right? It's taking every step that you can. And one of the problems, I think those of you who work in the social work areas and in pastoral areas would understand is when you don't confront problems, you enable people in their bad behavior, right? And you're not really doing them any favor. It's like being a parent to a child, and you let them get away with every bad behavior because you don't want to confront them. Well, ultimately, you're going to end up with a spoiled brat, rotten kid. And I think that's sort of what happens here. Okay, so there's a recurring theme in Paul's writing of working toward the unity of the church and avoiding divisions caused by side issues. Again, Paul is trying to get the church focused on being the church in these early days. Now, I wonder, would there be in America today regional differences on this? So we are the product of Southern culture. And in Southern culture, it's not nice to confront people, right? Someone can stand up and tell a bald-faced lie, and you may get in more trouble for calling them a liar than for the fact they actually lied. This happened to me a few years ago in an organization where, I mean, just blatant lying, which I had to call out. And I was the one who was in trouble because I called someone a liar. It is not polite in Southern culture to call someone a liar, even if they are.
Add bless your heart to the end of it.
Yeah.
We don't hang our dirty linens out in public. That's Southern culture.
That's right. So I think that's part of this issue for us as well. So this bit in verse 11 about such a person being perverted and sinful, I think this is an extreme case. But there are sometimes extreme cases, right? There are times in the life of any organization, whether it be a family, a church, a workplace, a civic organization, all the dynamics are the same, where someone can become so obsessed with their grudge or their cause that it becomes perverted, right? Think school as a context. The parent who feels like their daughter has been neglected from the drill team or the cheerleaders, or the father who thinks his son has been wrongly denied being the quarterback on the football team. And when that festers, it becomes an obsession over time. And that's the kind of long-term thing I think Paul's talking about here. Does that make sense? Anyone have a comment or question or a suggestion about this? So you can have an honest disagreement. This is not about that. This is about someone with a grudge. Someone who, despite being talked to, persists in doing things that are divisive to the body of Christ. Yeah. All right, let's. Would someone now read for us? Mike, you are our other reader, right?
You'll love those words.
Yeah, verse 12 to the end.
Okay. I'm planning to send either Artemis or Tychicus, to you, whoever they are. If one of them arrives, do your best to meet me at Nicopolis. Goodness gracious. For I have decided to stay there for the winter. Everything you can do to help Zemas, the lawyer, and Apollos with their trip But do everything that you can to help Zenas, the lawyer, and Apopolis with their trip. See that they are given everything they need. Our people must learn to do good by meeting the urgent needs of others. Then they will not be unproductive. Everybody here sends greetings. Please give my greetings to the believers, all who love us. May God's grace be with you all.
So typical Pauline name dropping that we often get at the beginning and the end of Paul's letters, right? And their greetings and admonitions to certain people, which lends authenticity to the letter, but it reminds us of the fact this is happening in a particular place at a particular time. And Paul, as he was writing these letters, had no idea they would become Holy Scripture. We just got to remind ourselves that these were letters written to churches in specific situations, but we have brought them together and considered them to be divine wisdom for us. I want to point out verse 14, which goes back to our conversation from last week. And let people learn to devote themselves to good works in order to meet urgent needs, so that they may not be unproductive. A recurring theme of this book, this letter, is on good works. And we talked a lot last week about the meaning of good works and the fruit of good works. And here it is again. At the very end. This reminds me of that old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop. The way to be not unproductive, meaning productive, is to be involved in good works. Busy yourself with things that matter. So what is the best cure for someone who stirs up trouble somewhere? Give them something to do. Positive, right? Except in extreme circumstances, that often works. What is the best thing to do with a child who's getting into trouble? Give them something to do. Engage them in that. Those of you who are teachers, right? What do you do with that precocious, troubled child in your class? Give them a project. Give them something to do along the way. That's part of the answer to this, but the deeper answer we learned last week is that we as Christians ought to be involved in good works. We ought to be doing these things because it's the nature of who we are, right? Now, we've come to the end of Titus. We've been in this book a long, long time. You may not even remember the beginning of the book. Impressions, thoughts. I bet most of us had never read this book before, or certainly not paid much attention to it. What are your impressions?
Well, you overlooked the significant part, which is he sent him a lawyer.
He sent him a lawyer.
There you go.
Thank you, Guy.
We'd underline that.
I'm sorry, I failed to point that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if there was a cost associated with that.
Oh, I'm sure.
I will go.
I'll inquire with you. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Titus that you'd like to share as we wrap this up?
It's the one thing that comes. I'm not sure that human nature has changed greatly in the last 2,000 years.
Very relevant,
It's
isn't it?
amazing that these things are relevant as things
Yeah,
that happen
very
now.
relevant. I agree. Well, let's talk for a moment about what we're going to do in the coming weeks. I've had some good input from you guys about lesson ideas and study ideas. So I think during Advent, we probably need to do some sort of Christmas lessons. It just seems like a good idea. And so we'll do something about that. we've got we've got 4 Sundays in November before we get there. And so I'm trying to think, we can't do a Bible book study in 4 weeks around here. We might could do 10 verses or something.
Unless it was mighty short.
Yeah.
And we can't even do it as short.
We might could explore Jesus wept for. Anyone have a suggestion you'd like to throw out about something you'd like to study during the month of November?
Our dear friend Thomas Wright, I have a new book out.
Oh, he always has a book out, yeah. There's always that. What other ideas, anything you're dying to talk about?
I'm not dying to talk about this, but Mike's been going to that study on Wednesday night about how to talk to people you love about religion and politics. He's gotten a lot out of that, and I don't know if that would be
Now, I didn't get to go to all 4 of them, but I.
Well, actually, has anyone else been to that Wednesday night class?
No, I went last Sunday though.
It's
He
a
had-
Sunday conversation.
Yes, uh-huh.
Yeah, I actually have wondered about that. I thought about that driving to church this morning.
The one Kevin's doing?
The one Kevin's
Yes,
doing.
Kevin.
I think that would be a great idea.
Would you be able to
You've
find
been in,
scripture?
you.
Oh,
well,
yes.
a couple of them
2 of
didn't.
the 4.
Yeah, 2 of the 4, that's what I had.
Yeah, and more the application, the overview,
Right.
but, how do we do this? How do,
Yeah. So one of the Sundays in November, we're going to do a lesson on generosity as part of our all-in campaign that we're doing, and we'll work that in as well. But we could certainly do a couple of weeks on civility and talking to each other. I think that seems appropriate.
It follows what we just talked about.
Yeah.
It does.
How to not get churched. That's really the
Number 1 trauma.
the topic.
Haven't you just found that the best way to get along in politics is you don't discuss it?
Yeah, that's right, don't say.
Why? Why would you try to discuss something when there are such polar opposites?
Well, sometimes you're forced to.
Well, not if you disagree, that we're not gonna talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're gonna be great friends, but we're not gonna talk about that. I find it completely
Now,
impossible.
Tricia,
to
that's
talk with
good,
somebody.
but what
Yeah.
if you decide, okay, we're not gonna talk about religion, we're not gonna talk about politics, and so you just sit there and look at one?
Oh, no, we can shopping, we can have lunch. we can
I mean,
talk.
you can have a disagreement over what's properly in chicken salad.
Yeah, I mean,
Should it have grapes in it or not?
I have not been able to visit with somebody who's politically.
But
Yeah, one of my friends tells the story about being at a women's auxiliary meeting years ago, in which the honest to goodness was a 30-minute debate about what should be in the chicken salad that they would serve at the next thing, and it was all about grapes, I think. Yeah.
Well, that sounds good, but what happens is, if there are things you just can't mention with really close friends that totally disagree with you, there's an awkwardness there.
I
And
guarantee
believe
you.
me, we know this personally.
We know.
And so it's not so much about how to talk about those issues as it is about how to look at each other when you're totally disagreeing.
And that's what.
And that was helpful. He got some good ideas that I just thought might be helpful for the class.
Okay, we'll do a couple weeks on that.
It's just a thought.
Yeah, we'll do a couple weeks on that. I'll get Kevin to give me his notes, and I'll see if I can improve on them. All right. Well, let's. That ends our lesson.
Darrell said she had a question, but whoever was monitoring today.
Okay. What is the
So-
question?
Well, I told her to send it to me. She sent it to somebody else.
Well, Tim
Here,
and
it's
John
gonna
Eric, who's
come
not
in a
here
minute.
today.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
tell her I'll email her I'll
All
email
right.
you the answer.
So in the prayer